How did I get complex PTSD? One of the things that I'm finding today, a lot of people, I've seen in a few groups, quite a few people are triggered. It's Father's Day today. And some people have had sexual abuse from their fathers, or not just from their fathers, but, other people in their lives. And Father's Day can be triggering for some, like Christmas can be, and Mother's Day and such things. So I do feel for people out there today that are being triggered by memories of, events like Christmas and whatever, and Father's Day and Mother's Day, where they've been through child abuse. And some people are celebrating, which is great, that there are good people in this world, but it's hard for some. What I've been reading the last week, is the Tao of Fully feeling. I've been reading chapter 8, but I've very much done with chapter 8 for now. It was about verbal abuse and such like, and how we get toxic shame and we suffer as adults. The other book I read from is Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. So looking at what complex PTSD is, I'm going to read for you. It says, how did I get complex PTSD? And when I read this article, it's from Pete Walker's webpage. And I'm going to bring up the webpage so that I can show you where you go and have a look and maybe see how it applies to you. Because what I find is a lot of people who have anxiety or who are having panic attacks as adults have basically been through trauma as childhood, whether it's verbal abuse, physical abuse, or sexual abuse, or a mix of all three. A lot of people have been told in society that because if it's parental abuse, we're told that because it's our parents that we've got to forgive, and we bypass the reality of our pain. So what happens is that we, by repressing it and by just pretending it didn't happen or it wasn't that bad, as we get into adulthood, we get to a position where we might start having, when we're no longer disassociating, we might start having flashbacks and memories, and we might begin to feel angry. So then we begin to have what's called the fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses, which are the responses we used in childhood to get through. We begin to play them out in our adult lives. So it's a nightmare for many. I know myself, looking back now, I know what CPTSD is. It's not a disorder. It is a response to events over time. And I will explain, similar to PTSD, what the difference is. The difference is with PTSD, it is generally a one-off event. So it could be a veteran goes to war and has a one-off horrific experience, which is unusual. There'll probably be many, but it's called PTSD. Complex PTSD generally relates back to childhood, where over years, events have been, and the conditioning and cruelty builds up over many years. So it becomes complex. So it's a more severe form of PTSD. In society, PTSD is taken quite seriously when it comes to certain things, like, people might have a horrific event or, something like a car crash, or see something that's terrible. But a lot of people who've been through childhood trauma are bypassed, but society is beginning to change now and see the reality. So I've got one watching, but here goes. I'm going to read, how did I get complex PTSD? And you can always play this back. So Pete Walker, his webpage, he says, the genesis of complex PTSD is often associated with extended periods of ongoing physical or sexual abuse in childhood. My observations, however, convince me that ongoing extremes of verbal and or emotional abuse also cause it. Moreover, as an upcoming article on my website will explain, if I wiped myself out there, no. Thought I lost my screen. So he says, moreover, as an upcoming article on my website will explicate, long-term childhood emotional neglect alone can often create complex PTSD and a propensity to emotional flashbacks. This can perhaps best be understood by noting the conditions that prevailed as the human brain evolved during the hunter-gatherer times, which represents 99.8% of our time on this planet. Children's vulnerability to predators caused them to evolve on intense instinctual fear response to being left alone without protection. Fear became the child's hardwired response to separation from a protective adult and linked automatically to the fight response. So the infant and toddler would automatically cry angrily for attention, help, cessation of abandonment, even at the briefest loss of contact with parental figures. Beasts of prey only needed seconds to snatch away an unprotected child. So if we can go back in history, we can see that clearly as human beings, if we didn't have as a baby the ability to cry and, tears and scream out, then, maybe when people lived in caves and such like, it would have meant that, the human race would have become extinct. So it's babies and their emotions and their emotional states, crying when they're hungry and stuff like that, and being fearful of not being near their parents is a very natural process. So I'm going to continue reading this. So he says, in present time dysfunctional families, many parents disdain children for needing so much attention from them and react contemptuously to a baby or toddler's plaintive call for connection and attachment. Contempt can sometimes be more traumatizing than physical abuse. It is a toxic cocktail of verbal and emotional abuse, a deadly amalgam of rage and disgust. Rage creates fear and disgust creates shame in a child in a way that soon teaches her to refrain from crying out or from ever asking for attention, and before long from seeking any kind of help or connection at all. Particularly abusive parents deepen the abandonment trauma by linking corporal punishment with contempt. Moreover, as stated, complex PTSD can also be caused by emotional neglect alone. Emotional neglect also typically occurs in most situations of prolonged contempt and physical abuse. Parents who systematically ignore or turn their backs on a child's call for attention, connection, or help abandon their child to unmanageable amounts of fear, which over time devolve into the child giving up and succumbing to depressed, death-like feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. These types of rejection simultaneously magnify the child's fear and eventually add a veneer of shame to it. Over time, this fear and shame cancerously begets a toxic inner critic that increasingly dominates the psyche, which programs of endangerment and self-disgust and perfectionism until a full-blown case of PTSD is established. And he says, see my articles on the inner critic and outer critic. Moreover, to the duration and degree that emotional abandonment takes place, and to the degree that there is no alternative adult, relative, or other sibling, neighbor, or teacher to turn to for comfort and protection, to that degree does PTSD set in, and to that degree can a myriad of triggers, external and internal, activate the individual into flashing back into painful, emotional, and toxic cognitive conditions of childhood. And this is especially true when the abandonment occurs 24/7, 365 days for the first few years. So we can see with complex PTSD that as we evolve into adults, if we've been mistreated as children and been through sexual abuse or violence or disdain or verbal abuse, then we end up as adults that are not able to, we've had arrested development, which means that, if we've not been nurtured, then we won't go to people, or we won't be able to stand up and speak our truth. We won't be able to ask for our needs to be met. And then it can get to social anxiety as adults. And there are so many side effects of having an abusive childhood. And it seems to me that a lot of people, when I tell my story to people, they'll say, well, I didn't have it as bad as you, but I did have this. We cannot compare complex PTSD or PTSD. We're all individuals like snowflakes. We're all really extremely individual. So one circumstance is not worse than another, and a child is a child. So any abuse on any level to children, be it sexual, verbal, or physical, it cannot be measured. So I think that the only way through it, Knowing myself that I did not know that I was having flashbacks, which are the 4 Fs, which are fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. I'm going to see if I can share my screen, because this might be useful to somebody out there. I'm going to share, hopefully. Let me see, share screen. This might be helpful. So if I can, I'm going to have to come out of this. Bear with me, because this is going to be important for some people out there. I need to click on to this. I'm going to show you a website of Pete Walker who completely understands what complex PTSD is. And without the psychoeducation, here you go. You can see this website. So what we've got, without the psychoeducation, we can believe that we are a lost cause, and that a lot of our anger and resentment as adults is, basically we go into toxic shame. We think there's something wrong with us. So Pete Walker, with this website, will you'll be able to see what's going on for you on a very deep level. He's got here how we can manage emotional flashbacks. So you can look there. And that's a 12-page article, I believe, 12 pages. So I'm going to go back again. And he's got flashback management. So here, for anybody who has CPTSD and, they flashbacks, fight, flight, freeze, fawn. So let's go through this. He says fighting when we go into fight, we have fighting or over asserting oneself with others in a narcissistic and entitled ways, such as misusing power or promoting excessive self-interest. And this can also happen with the fight mode. This can happen if a child has been over-adulated. So if we make a child into the king of the castle or the little prince and speak to a child as if they're a god, then we can also put them into, being narcissistic. As parents can do that. So there has to be a very fine balance with, how children are treated. But also this can happen with abuse. It can, if a child's abused, then we can also have the fight mode. The flight mode is when we flee. If you can see my cursor there, fleeing obsessive compulsively into activities such as workaholism, sex and love addiction, or substance abuse, uppers. 3, freezing is numbing out dissociative ways such as sleeping excessively, over fantasizing, or tuning out with a TV, medications or downers. So I used to do that with alcohol. I've no longer drink. I stopped in 2012. So we all do it in different ways. And fawning is fawning in self-abandoning and obsequious codependent relating. The fawn response to trauma is delineated, sorry, I'm reading that he talks about that on another website, he says, or on this website, Codependency and Trauma. It's an article. So then he's got which is brilliant, 13 steps here for managing flashbacks. Now I've got that link below this video, okay? So you can check out how to do that. And then you've got a PDF that you can click on and you can download this and print it off. It's really, really useful, managing flashbacks. And you can see if you print it off, it's in bold. So if you carry it with you, those bits, if you start having a flashback, you can say, I am having a flashback. And often that's enough to help us to step out of what we're going through. Going back to this web page, you'll be able to see a lot more here. So he's got the Tao of Fully Feeling. That's the book I've been reading from this week. And I think abandonment, depression. The other thing we need to do is shrinking the inner critic and the outer critic. So you can look at that. So the inner critic is where we beat ourselves up, okay? And then the outer critic, shrinking the inner critic. The outer critic is where we're very critical with people outside ourselves. And that's basically because our trust often has been so annihilated that we can't trust people and we're very wary. And that can cause us to go into manipulation or staying away from people and avoiding people altogether. So I'm going to stop share. And I think that is it for today. I think this little bit of information is going to be useful. I'm going to continue with reading a bit more of the Tao of Fully Feeling tomorrow. You can see that book there. I was on chapter 8, and it's been a useful book to begin to dig into. I have read it before, and I think that I do feel for anybody out there today who's been triggered by Father's Day, anybody who's, had abuse from a father, particularly, violence or sexual abuse or any abuse, it's completely a tricky day for people out there who are in the world, who've had that experience. And as Pete Walker says in his book, and the statistics are, we've got 1 in 3 girls that have gone through sexual abuse, violence or violations, and 1 in 5 boys. So we're looking at a huge amount of the population of planet Earth, of the 7.5 billion of us who are walking around, with trauma. So I'm going to leave it there for today. I'm going to end my meeting, and do play it back and share out with anybody. Hit the notification button. If you need help with this, I'm over on Facebook. You can private message me there, because I do know that not everybody wants to leave or chat on these streams, because it's a touchy subject or tricky subject for many, many people. So I'm going to end my stream. Thank you for watching.